Greetings, friends and colleagues. My name is Tariq Masood. I'm the Sultan Qaboos bin Saeed of Oman Professor of International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Middle East Initiative. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's talk with Dr. Lydia Assouad entitled Charismatic Leaders and Nation Building. Now, Dr. Assouad is a little bit different from the prior speakers we've had this semester in that she is a highly sophisticated and technical academic economist. But her talk today, which is based on her very innovative econometric study of nation building in early 20th century Turkey, is highly relevant to our ongoing discussion of the prospects for change in the contemporary Middle East in general and in the Arab world in particular. Now, the way I see it, the region is torn today between two competing visions of progress: a bottom-up vision that seeks to expand political participation, and a top-down vision that seeks to strengthen the state, both in terms of its coercive power and its infrastructural power, and which seeks to transform the citizenry from one that is seen from on high as indolent, dependent, and susceptible to radicalization in the name of religion into one that is innovative, independent, and immune to the nostrums of so-called religious extremists. Now, the first vision of progress is embodied in the pro-democracy movements of the Arab Spring. It's embodied in the decade-old democracy of Tunisia, and it's embodied in the ongoing transitions and movements for progress and political accountability that we see in Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Lebanon. The second top-down vision of progress is best represented by the region's so-called modernizing autocrats, of whom today Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia is often held up as the most prominent example. If you were with us at our last Middle East Initiative event with Professor Bernard Heikel, you heard how Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS as he is often called, is often seen not just as the brutal dictator who ordered the murder of a mildly critical newspaper columnist named Jamal Khashoggi, but rather as a reformer who has made quite dramatic and showy attempts to modernize education in his country, to liberate women from the shackles of old-time religion, and to make other important changes in that country's socioeconomic framework. Now, when MBS first appeared on the scene and before he committed the crime that came to world attention, he was most often compared to the subject of today's talk, the founder of modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk was president of Turkey for 15 years, from 1923 to 1938, and his stamp on the country and on its national identity is visible even today. It's visible in the ideological commitment that many Turks have to secularism and the separation of church and state, and it's visible in the names that many Turks take for themselves, and it's even visible in the alphabet that they use to write those names. Now, I have and have always had my own thoughts about whether MBS and his ilk were anything like the great man Ataturk, to whom they are often compared. But if you want to answer that question for yourself, then it's useful to explore what Ataturk did and why he was successful, and indeed whether he was successful. And that task is the task that today's speaker sets for herself. Now, I'm going to cede the floor to Dr. Assouad in a moment, but please let me introduce her briefly. Lydia Assouad is a Ph.D. candidate at the Paris School of Economics. So even though I've called her Dr. Assouad, I guess technically she is not yet a doctor, but I believe in, I'm an Egyptian, and we call everybody, once they get admitted to a program, we call them doctor. And certainly once they've achieved scholarly achievements as Dr. Assouad has, she's earned the title as far as I'm concerned. She is a visiting scholar in the economics department at Harvard, and she's written several papers, including some highly regarded studies of economic inequality in Lebanon and in the broader Middle East. I am really thrilled to have her here today to talk about her current research, which, as I said, is this extraordinarily innovative study that identifies with greater precision than previously thought imaginable just how important the personal exertions of the so-called modernizing autocrat can be. Now we'll proceed as follows. Dr. Assouad will speak for about 30, 35 minutes, and she'll give a formal presentation with slides. And then I will ask her a few questions. I always abuse my position. I will try not to do that so much today, but I can't promise I won't do it at all. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And I'll give you instructions as to how to lodge your questions when the time comes. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lydia Assouad.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining today. And many thanks, Professor Massoud, for this kind introduction. I'm very honored and excited to be here at the Middle East Initiative and to have the opportunity to present my research today. So let me share my screen and let me know if everything is working fine for you. Perfect. So my talk today is titled Charismatic Leaders in Nation Building, Ataturk's Leadership and the Formation of Turkish Identity, which would be about the role of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, in spreading a new Turkish national identity. And this is part of my PhD thesis. But before starting the presentation, let me just briefly introduce my background and my research. So as Professor Massoud said, I'm trained as an economist. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Paris School of Economics, but I also have a background in sociology and in history, and I actually come from institutions that really valued pluridisciplinarity and pushed us to combine the most we can quantitative and qualitative data, and in particular archival data. And I really do believe that comparative historical approaches to political economy are very useful to understand political processes, not only in history, but also today. And basically understanding the role of Mustafa Kemal, exactly as you said in the introduction, can help us understand a lot the rise, the function of other leaders in the Middle East today. With this in mind, I started actually working on income and wealth inequality in the Middle East as a whole, but also in Lebanon at the World Inequality Lab. And actually, my research there made me find extreme levels of inequality, both within countries, but also between countries. And when I found these results, which were actually in opposition with a widespread narrative, according to which there was not so much inequality in the region, I wanted to understand why. And that led me to try to think about the role of the state and perhaps the fragility of Middle Eastern states. And with this in mind, this led me to read about state formation and nation building policies in the region and to empirically study for now Turkey. So that's the entire process. And working on Turkey then made me, like, I was really struck to see how important Ataturk's role was. And that's what explains this chapter of my thesis that I'm gonna present today. So actually, the starting point of this project is the fact that the role of leaders in history is one of the most debated and oldest questions across social sciences. So on the one hand, you have a very large literature that argues that the evolution of history is mostly driven by institutions and social deterministic forces, and that the motives, the abilities, or the behaviors of specific individuals cannot impact a society trajectory. So basically, according to these views, leaders are the simple product of the society, or as Spencer put it, before a great man can remake his society must make him. But on the other hand, you have several theories that argued that the evolution of history is mostly driven by the idiosyncratic causative influences of specific individuals. And you can track back those theories to Thomas Carlyle's great man theory of history, according to which the world history is but the biography of great men, or to Max Weber's more nuanced argument, according to which charismatic authority is key to legitimize new social and political order. And although those views are less dominant, we actually quite easily can think about examples of leaders that are seen still today as having shaped the future of their nation. Napoleon, Hitler, Gandhi, Mao, etc. And however, there are no clear empirical tests of this hypothesis. And that's precisely the gap I want to fill with this project by focusing on one specific historical example, the case of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. So I guess I don't need to present him in a Middle Eastern center, but Mustafa Kemal was an Ottoman marshal who rose to prominence during World War I and the Independence War. And basically is seen as the hero of the Independence War, who prevented European armies from conquering Turkey. So this prestige put him at the head of the newly independent state in 1923, and he created a new nation state and led drastic nation-building reforms to create a new state with a new Turkish national identity. So he's really an typical example of a charismatic leader and is often quoted as so. And Turkish modern history is often linked to his biography. But more interestingly, he took a very active and personal role to buttress the new regime and to explain what was his nationalist ideology to the population. So he visited more than a fourth of all Turkish cities since 1923, so the first year of the creation of the Republic, until his death in 1938. At a time where it was quite costly to travel. So the visits were aimed at explaining the reforms to the local populations and happened prior to the age of radio, at a time where the literacy rate was quite low. So this enabled me to identify a very local effect independently from other vectors of information. So using this quite unique setting, I want to answer the following question. Can a leader shape identity and legitimize a new political order? And if so, how? So to do so, I built a novel historical database from the archive at the district level, so approximately 1,000 districts, and collected data on all of his visits. I have the exact date, length, and activity he had. I also built a new way to measure national identity, or at least the control of the state over the periphery. I'll come back on this later, which is the adoption of first name in pure Turkish, Öztürkçe, which is the new language introduced by the state as part of the homogenizing endeavor and nation building process. Then, using this database, I use time and geographic variation in Ataturk's visits to district in a difference in differences design, so a typical identification strategy used by economists and econometrics, to test whether the exposure to a leader affects citizens' take-up of the new national identity. And in particular, I leveraged the large amount of information on his trajectory and focus on stops in between two main cities targeted. And this enables me to get closer to causal estimates. I'll come back on this later. So this is to have a visual representation of the visits. So you have Turkey here in dark. You see the railway at the end of the Ottoman Empire, and in lighter dark, the railway network after his death in 1939. In white, you have the districts he hasn't visited that are mostly districts isolated and in the Kurdish provinces and Armenian provinces. In light blue, you have districts he visited at the beginning of the period, and in darker blue at the end. So you see there is quite some variation, and that he mostly visited places along the railway lines. So to give you a preview of the findings, before going into the detail, I found that the districts he visited are more likely to adopt the names in the new language introduced by the state. A visit increases the share of pure Turkish name by 1 percentage point, which is quite a large effect of approximately 10% of the sample mean. Then it's still work in progress. So if you have any comment on this, I try to understand the mechanisms. And for the moment, I find two main mechanisms. First, that it's something that seems to be about him. Maybe it's his charisma, his status, because I find that he was more effective than his second man and the Prime Minister, Ismet Inonu. And that the effect is mostly due to co-optation of local elites. The effect is stronger in places where he met these local elites and not in places where he met with the crowd. So hopefully this paper will contribute to various literature. I'm not going to spend some time on it, but just on the historiography on the Kemalist reforms. So there is a very large literature on the Turkish Revolution and the Kemalist reforms. And of course, I'm not quoting everyone here. Sorry about that. But to synthesize it, there is a first historiography that really takes the view of the state and of the Kemalist elite and has a very top-down statist approach, saying that the state was very efficient in spreading the revolution, that it was a success, and that everything changed quite rapidly and in a uniform manner. And this view was criticized. A more recent literature emphasized how local population reacted, the importance of bottom-up processes, of daily way to renegotiate, accept, or on the contrary, sometimes backlash the new revolution. And the way I see this paper fitting in this literature is that I do empirically confirm a role for Kemal. He was efficient in increasing the state control, but I'm not entering in this very big statist view, in the sense that if this view was true, Ataturk would not have even gone there. He could have passed laws, and the fact that he went there, that he had to meet with local elites, emphasized the importance of the interaction in the peripheries, etc., and underline the role of the co-optation of local elites. And the effect is mostly happens mostly in visited cities, not in the countryside, where 80% of the population was living. So it's not in contradiction with some work that have emphasized some backlashes in the countryside, and the fact that there it took more time for the states to reach the periphery. Okay, so I will now go quickly through the historical background of the Turkish Revolution, and then present the data I collected and the strategy I used to get to identify causal effects. And I'll present my main results and the mechanisms I'm currently finding. So for the historical background, so after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire during World War I, a resistance led by Mustafa Kemal and other Ottoman soldiers secured today's Turkish territory from European armies and created an independent nation state out of a 6th century-old multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multilingual empire. And they implemented a set of radical nation-building reforms. So those reforms really affected all realms of societies. They were political and legal, so I guess most of you know about it, but they abolished the Sultanate and the Caliphate, created a republic, removed the Sharia law, and introduced European civil and penal codes. But they also passed policies that targeted the social and cultural life of Turkish citizens. So they centralized and secularized education, closed religious schools, forbade some type of clothing, changed even the way to count time, and imposed surname laws, so to use now patronymic format as was done in Europe. So their goal was to create a republic that is secular, modern, westernized, and built around one ethnicity, the Turkish ethnicity. So one central aspect of this revolution, of this cultural revolution, was the language reform. It was really a cornerstone of the homogenizing endeavor. So it's good to recall that at the time there was a large diversity of dialects spoken. People were talking Arabic, Kurdish, Turkish, and all of these dialects were using several different alphabets. And the Ottoman Turkish was mostly the language, a written language known by a small educated elite, and the literacy rate was quite low. So the goal of the Kemalist elite was to create a language that was easier to learn and that would be common across classes, but also regions, religions, and ethnicity. And they did so in 2 steps. So it's really a fascinating process. First, they Latinized the alphabet to make the alphabet further away from the Islamic culture, because the Arabic alphabet was clearly linked to Islam. But second, and more interestingly, they purified the language. So they recreated what they call the pure Turkish language by collecting words from the Turkish oral tradition and folklore. So this was partly top down. They created an institution, hired linguists to collect those words, and asked the citizens to contribute. And this process was done quite rapidly and led to the diffusion of a list of a lot of words in pure Turkish, in booklets and newspapers that I entirely digitized. And really, the language is a symbol of the political ideology, in the sense that it embodies both the secularism, but also the fact that it's built around one ethnicity. So very quickly, it's important to recall that it was done in an authoritarian manner around one unique party, and that the state used various propaganda tools to spread this new ideology. So one of them was the personality cult and the visit of Kemal. So very quickly about the cult, Ataturk was a hero of the world, the chief, but he was also called the first teacher, or his nickname means Father Turks. So here it's an image from a book by Kristen Fabi at the Harvard Business School that is really embodies this. We see Ataturk himself removing all the old institution that existed. So we see this idea that he had a big role, and the personality cult that was built around his figure. And here is an example of the visits that I'm studying. So it's a visit in Sivas, quite famous, where he's basically teaching the new alphabet to the crowd. And we can read this quickly. Ataturk invited a butcher from the crowd to the blackboard. Abedin, the butcher, came to the front and admitted that he did not know the new alphabet. In 10 minutes, Ataturk taught him the vowels and showed him how to write his names. As Abedin learned a new letter, repeated rounds of applause were shaking the square. When Abedin finally was able to write his name, the square erupted in cheers and shouted, "Long live Turkey and the great Ataturk." So this is the kind of event I'm studying. But the state used other tools via educations, more classic tools. They also censored media and built local clubs, the nationalistic clubs, to spread the propaganda. So let me move a bit more quickly on the data. So on the visits, I use mostly one secondary source, a book by Kojak Turk that compiled all information from his private diary, but also archival records of his visits. So I know the 100 visited cities, and for each of them, the number of visits, their position in the trajectory, date, and length. And I also have detailed information on the content of his visits. So I can classify visits depending on whether he visited the local elite or the crowd. And I systematically cross-checked all this information using academic article, municipality website, and I also went to the raw sources, the newspapers used by Kojak himself to check the information. So that's for my treatments. Let me move a bit quickly on this because time is running out. So for the outcome, I rely on a large literature that argues that first names are good proxy for identity and social preference, and are a good marker of attachment to a group. So this comes from psychology and sociology. And so I have all the birth certificates between 1920 and 1950s with information on first name, sex, date, and place of birth. And to classify those first names, I digitize all the booklet and newspaper that I was talking about using the sources of Meltem Turkus, so a historian specialist of the language reform. And I use the fact that in Turkish, first names are words. So I'm able to classify first names on between pure Turkish and not pure Turkish. So this is very quickly an example of the source. So this is one booklet that I digitized. And here very quickly is a newspaper that basically give a dictionary of the new words and their former Ottoman synonyms. And this graph is the raw graph that shows the evolution of first names in pure Turkish over the period. So this graph is very interesting for several reasons. So first, we see that the share of pure Turkish was low and not evolving in parallel, and if anything, higher in not visited districts. But then we see that they increase, and they increase more quickly in visited places. And there is this national peak in 1934 that is quite striking. So the first names were adopted, it was quite efficient, but the peak is stronger in visited places. So for the empirical strategy, I use a static difference in differences that compare basically visited and non-visited districts across time. So I'm not going to enter in the detail, but basically my outcomes are the names, and my main treatment is a dummy switching to one the year a district is visited for the first time, and I have fixed effects that allows me to hold fixed other characteristics. And I restrict my sample so I remove the places where he comes from and where he wants to go. So when I know he comes from A and wants to go to B, I know those places are planned and targeted, and they are probably endogenous. He goes there because he will be more efficient there, probably he knows more people. I only look at the places in between where he had to stop because Turkey is a big country, so he had to make stops on the way. And only compare those places with other districts on the itinerary. And what is quite good is that those places in between happen to be quite similar along a bunch of characteristics. So these are the variables that are collected at the district level, with information on the population, the connection to the network, the share of the minority share of Greek or Armenian or Kurdish, whether it was occupied during the World War I. So I have a bunch of characteristics, also geographic characteristics, type of crops, etc. And while the targeted places are super different, my districts in between are more comparable. So that's why I focus on them to make a causal argument. So now let me move to my main results. So here is the main figure that shows the impact of Ataturk's visit on the pure Turkish names. So you have the years to the event. So the event is the first visit. So 10 years before and 10 years after, and 0 is the year of the first visit. So what we can see is that after the visit, there is an increase in the share of pure Turkish names. It takes a year, which is not surprising, because it takes time to have new children too. And then the effect is quite persistent up until the year 20. But more importantly, all the years before the event, we find that the effect is significantly not different from 0, which is a way to test for the parallel trend assumption, which enables me to say that the places were not so different, and it's really the visits that explain this increase. Unsurprisingly, this increase in the pure Turkish names corresponds, but mechanically, to a decrease in Arabic first names. So we can make the same conclusion here on this graph. After a visit, the share of Arabic names in those localities decreases. So I do a bunch of robustness checks, but I'm not going to go through them to be sure that my results hold. Now let me move to the mechanisms, try to understand what happens. So hopefully now I convinced you that when he goes to certain districts and holds some activities, people adopt more the new names than in similar districts he didn't stop. But now it's interesting to understand what's happening locally, what's going on, and why this persists so much. So a first hypothesis is to know if it's something about it. Is it his charisma, his prestige, or something about his status, the fact that he's the president? And to test for this, I collected similar data and replicated the analysis, comparing Kemal and İsmet İnönü, so the prime minister of Turkey and his second man. So İnönü too made a lot of visits, and all the visits had the same purpose, to explain the new reforms and law and what it meant to be a new Turkish citizen. So I replicated the analysis, and what I found, so let me go on this table with you. So the first three columns, the first column, we see the pure effect of Ataturk in the entire sample. And the second is the effect of İnönü. So both men had an effect. İnönü's visit also had an important effect in explaining what was going on. But the Ataturk effect is stronger than the İnönü effect. And when we put both of them, we can see that the Ataturk effect is way stronger. Now I do my restriction, as I was telling you about. I remove the biggest places he targeted, etc. And then, interestingly, so the effect of Ataturk stays strong and significant, but then the effect of İnönü is way smaller and not significant anymore. So this shows that Ataturk's effect was stronger than İnönü effect, that we can interpret as the charisma or the status of Ataturk. So a second test I did is use the information I had on all the type of activity he held. So, and I did some heterogeneity exercises depending on this data. So results are in this table. So what we can conclude here is that when we look at the column 3, is that in places where he met with the elite, the effect is way stronger compared to places where he met with the mass only, where on average he had an effect, but it's not significant for the mass, and way less, smaller for negative for the mass, and way smaller than the elite. So this shows that most of the effect is driven by places where he had dinner, lunch with local economic, political, or military elite. So it's not so much a mass effect. So, so to conclude, I'm on time, perfect. So my research question was, can a leader shape identity and legitimize a new political order? So I assembled a new historical database to answer this question and built an original measure of national identity, or at least control of the state over the periphery. And the answer is yes. He increased by 10% the use of the new language. How? Currently, it seems to be due to idiosyncrasy and co-optation, but I'm working on more. So the next step, I want to unpack the local effect after a visit and understand to which extent the leader is a complement or a substitute to institutions. For an example, does after a visit, now that he trusts the local elite, he sends more resources, and then schools are built there, etc., which explains why the effect is persistent. I would like to identify elite names and see if the effect is driven by the elite that are the first to change their names, and after this trickle down to the rest of the population. I also collected all his speeches and where he held them, and I could do some textual analysis and look at other effects on votes or school enrollment. So thank you very much for your attention, and again for this invitation. It's a great honor to be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lydia, for that really great paper. You know, the example of Ataturk is such an important one, and I for years have been frustrated by the historiography that makes it sound like Ataturk just decided to initiate these dramatic changes in the society and the Turks just saluted and went along with it. And of course we know that's not what happened. And I guess a question that I wanted to ask you, though, is about the essential assumption of this really quite ingenious study, and just to kind of concretize this for everybody, and also frankly, Dr. Lydia, to just ensure that I also understood what you're doing. It's, basically Ataturk is going from point A to point B, and he's making stops along the way. He could stop at multiple places along the way, but he only stops at, a few places. And we look at, or Dr. Lydia compares the uptake in Turkish names in the places that he stopped compared to all the places he could have stopped, correct? So it's like if I'm going from Boston to New York, I can stop in Providence or Hartford or New Haven or Stamford, and I end up stopping in say, Hartford and Stamford, and I'm comparing Hartford and Stamford to Providence and New Haven. And so I'm not comparing, you're not comparing the places on the railroad to places off the railroad.
No.
Right. So I got the, and you're basically saying where they stopped was basically random.
Close to random. So
close to,
of course, it's not perfectly random. There is still
yeah,
information that we cannot get,
yeah,
and he might have optimized his stops along the way. But
yeah.
what is reassuring is that those places are very similar along a bunch of dimensions, including political and cultural, to the districts very close he didn't stop.
Right. And so that's kind of what I wanted to ask you. I mean, the first rejoinder might be, look, of course, Ataturk, when he stops, when going from point A to point B, doesn't stop randomly like Tariq Massoud stops or Lydia Assouad stops, right? And particularly if there's a dinner being held for him or a public event, that speaks to some kind of planning such that we wouldn't think this was totally random. And so then the question is, well, what might be, could there be some unobserved heterogeneity that you're not picking up here? And again, because, this study is so well conceived, you did speak to a number of socioeconomic variables, and you showed how there's no real difference between the places where he stopped and the places he didn't stop on those variables. But, as you have pointed out, and as we know, Ataturk didn't just fight the colonizers, he also fought other Turks. I mean, the Turkish War for Independence included a kind of civil war. And I'm wondering if we have data, again, about the places on the railroad, which places were strongholds of opposition, of pro-caliphate forces, and which places weren't, because it seems a plausible hypothesis to me that he stopped in the places where they didn't have opposition, or the opposition had really been pacified, and didn't stop in places where there was still a security risk or still some latent support for the caliph. And as a result, that's why you see the variation in the uptake of the Turkish names.
Yes, so that's two very excellent points. So on the last one you made, so yes, indeed, on average, he probably went to places that would be more favorable to him. So he didn't go at all to the Kurdish provinces or Armenian provinces, for an example. And I think for most of the places where there were rebellions, he didn't go there. There are exceptions. He went to Menemen, for an example, where there was a big rebellion, etc. But on average, yes, he targeted and stayed in provinces that, along various characteristics, would be more pro him ex ante. So that's it. So I'm comparing within those. And your second point is very true and fair. So this was the best I could do, focusing on those stops. In particular, it's still imperfect in terms of the analysis of the activity, because those are endogenous. The fact that you can meet with the local elites in a place and not with another, it's not random, as you said. So on the mechanisms, it's much more descriptive evidence than a big causal effect. But on the main effects, there seems to be an average strong effect on first names. I hope I'm clear.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll open it up to our audience that is very eager, I think, to engage with you. What when you start I had the benefit of reading the paper, which was really a great pleasure. I mean, for years I've been studying Ataturk with a view towards writing about precisely this, but certainly not in the very creative way you've done. And you set up the paper as really a test of this Weberian notion of charismatic authority. And the idea is, could Ataturk, by the force of his charisma, have been the personal driver of some of the changes that we observed? But then, of course, when you look at the mechanisms suggest that there isn't a charisma effect going on, because if there was charisma that was operating to cause Turks to take up these new Turkish names, then in fact the effect would have been stronger, I would have expected, when he meets with the crowd. But it's in fact only when he, quote unquote, meets with local elites. And you do have one story in there, which was a very interesting story about how Ataturk is staying overnight at a doctor's house. He says to the doctor, "Do you have kids?" Doctor brings his kids. He says, "What are their names?" They have, they're described in the quote as daughters, but one of them is named Umran, and he changes his name to Turan, both of which are men's names. So, I don't know what's going on there. But the point is, that's a very direct, Ataturk having this direct effect on these political elites. And if that operated within that setting, then you really do wonder why it wouldn't operate when he goes into the crowd and tells everybody, like you showed us, that they need to adopt this new Turkish way. And so it suggests that really what is going on here is that in the places where he's meeting with elites, there, he's, as you pointed out, right, bringing some policy directives, et cetera. And so again, that seemed to me to be militating against the notion that charisma was operating.
Yes, completely. If I was not clear about this, I think I'm not testing the great man view. It's not a great man story at all. It's a more nuanced. So it's the more nuanced view of Weber that still gives some agency to leaders and leadership, but in complementarity with local characteristics and in particular institutions. So charismatic authority in the Weberian view is complementary to other strong forces. So yes, it's not at all the Carlyle story of strong men. And hopefully I'll have the data to test this, but currently not.
Yep. No, this is great. Okay. I'm going to stop abusing my position and allow our audience to have the distinct pleasure of engaging with your very fertile mind. So let me let me just let everybody know how to do this. In the Zoom software in which we have all been encapsulated this last year, there is at the very bottom of the window a participants icon. You click that, and actually, I believe if you have the new version of Zoom, you can click the reactions icon also at the bottom of the screen and raise your hand. And I will call on people in the order in which their hands are raised. The first person I have is Sheng Zhang, and then I have Irv Plotkin. So first I'm going to unmute Sheng, and go ahead, Sheng.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much, Doctor, for coming to the lecture. And I have a question regarding the theme of the lecture. We talk about you talked about how he's shaping identity of modern Turkey, and I think one of the most remarkable thing that makes Ataturk so special is that he constructed a modern identity with like modern type of nationalism in this ancient state with which was initially established upon religious identity rather than like ethnic identity. And there are a lot of people in like previous history want to do the same thing, but most of them have failed. So what is the special thing that make Turkey able to do so, maybe able to like totally reconstruct a new type of national coherence, and this thing would not fade away even if Ataturk is dead? Yeah,
Great question.
Yeah, great question. Thank you very much for this question. So yes, what's specific about Turkey? I think what's important to recall is that Ataturk arrives at the end of a very long-lasting process already. So you had at the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Tanzimat, and already certain attempts to secularize institutions, etc. So there is a lot of work on this. Again, to quote Christine Fabi, that I quoted in the talk, she explains in her book, Disciples of the State, it's fascinating that during the end of the Ottoman era, some secularist elites managed to co-opt already religious elite establishment. And it's the fact that the religious establishment was partly involved with statist institution that made the final attempts of Ataturk very efficient, compared, for an example, to Nasser. Often Nasser and Ataturk are compared, and Ataturk is presented as more efficient. This is one argument for an example. But I think what is key is to recall that it was a long historical processes, and Ataturk is not coming out of nowhere. He's really the final stroke of this longer lasting process.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I really appreciate your answer. But then again, it suggests that there might be other sources of this variation that are more longue durée sources. The other thing that I thought that you might want to look into, it's a kind of natural thing that I think clever economists do. So forgive me if I'm telling you something you thought about already. But you could also look at these areas and whether they have different politics today. I feel like I read all kinds of economist papers where they make those kinds of claims, and those are super implausible, but I could be convinced. But again, if again, as you point out, the Tanzimat, the Young Turks, there were all of these precursors to Ataturk that had to exist for Ataturk to be Ataturk. Then we're going to come and say like, oh, well, when he visited a particular area randomly for 6 hours, that suddenly had a dramatic effect that was way more than all of the historical forces over the course of the centuries that you've identified. Those two ideas seem like they sit uneasily together.
No, that's a very good comment. So what it's important to say is that the effect I identify doesn't mean that it's the only thing that mattered. So school mattered, the other type of propaganda mattered, etc. I'm just saying like it would be great to be able to quantify by which extent which one mattered the most and how they were complementary or not. But that would be another project. So here I'm not at all saying that that's the only thing that matter, but it's just that on top of those places, when they are comparable, this had an effect.
Got it. No, this is great. Thank you, Dr. Lydia. Okay, let me get more people to engage with you. So the next person I have is Irv Plotkin.
Hi, I want to congratulate you as a fellow econometrician on the cleverness of your work. I was going to make the same observation that Turk has already made, that the fact that he met with the elites, it looks like it was more of a top-down, and they then pressured the underlyings. But the question I would have is, have you thought of applying this in other situations, the growth of National Socialism with Hitler? And could you see anything that explains the current, what I would call backsliding in Turkey? Would those happen? I was almost going to say also the rise of Trumpism, but that's too controversial, I suppose. But I do want to compliment the work and think that can it be more widely applied? Like, what was the percentage of people who joined the National Socialist Party, given a visit or a non-visit? I don't know. The Germans are very good at keeping data, so they may have it.
Thank you very much for your comments, and no, that's actually a very relevant comparison to make. And there is actually a paper, and now I hope I'm not mispronouncing the name, by Munzert and Selb on the role of Hitler's visits in a very similar design, and they use a similar method, and they actually find that Hitler's speeches had no effect on Nazis' votes later on. So they found a null effect. Yes, but the paper was made. So
That's really fascinating. Do you have a perspective on why there might be a null effect in that fairly salient historical example? And that's on Nazi vote shares, which is presumably the decision of an individual to go and vote for a party, even a party as heinous as the Nazi party, is not as significant as the decision of what to name your daughter. And so do you have a perspective on why they have a null effect and you have a much more significant effect on a much more significant decision?
So yes, very good question. I'm not sure. The first point is to say, so what we were talking about earlier is that it's not a great man's story again. So it's really about, so he is still a rational leader that's planned his visits and meets with the local elites, but it's mostly about co-optation and putting things in place and negotiating and convincing people. But it's not this great man. And second, names and votes, exactly as you said, are very different in the sense that votes are hidden, whereas names are visible. So it's part of a thing that is one limit, in the sense that it's difficult to disentangle what the names in my context mean. Do they mean a strong adherence to Kemalism, or at least strong belief that Kemalism will last? Or is it opportunism? Okay, I name my children with the new name because I want jobs later on. I think it's not fear, in the sense that they didn't have the mean to repress depending on the first names. And because people were choosing last names too, there were much more margin of maneuver for first names. But it's true that it's because of the type of outcome we are looking at that are a bit different.
Excellent, thank you. The next person I have is Eric Boone, and then I have Uri Inspector. Let me unmute Eric here. Go ahead.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. First, thank you for the wonderful presentation. We really enjoyed it. And the question I had was that you mentioned that one of the overarching goals Ataturk had was to create a sense of national identity. And in order to do that, he championed secularism and moving away from Sharia law, for instance. I wonder, did Ataturk see Islam or religious culture as a barrier to forming a stronger national identity for Turkey?
So yes, when we read his biographies or like some of his speeches, he was really inspired by the Enlightenment ideology, etc. So he thought that secularism were going with modernity and progress, and that's why he wanted to secularize Turkey. But he didn't do it, or couldn't do it, in the same manner that it was done, for example, in France or elsewhere. And so the secular, the religious elite and identity stayed very strong. And actually, I didn't show it, but I did the same exercise looking at religious first names, and there is no effect whatsoever. So and it's not surprising, because being the new national Turkish identity was to be a Muslim Turk, Sunni Muslim Turk. So it was still very linked to Islam, despite the official discourse and his own preferences.
So this is really great. This does bring up a question that I had wanted to ask upon reading the paper. So could you give me an example of a name that was stopped being taken up? You know, because you talk about Arabic names and religious names. The one story you have in there that I remember was where Ataturk changes the name of somebody's child from Umran to Turan. And, you know, so Umran, is that an Arabic name or a religious name? Al Umran, you know, is it like, this is in the Quran. Yeah, if you could just give me an example, what's an Arabic name that Turks stopped using, and what's a religious name that Turks kept using? Sorry, doctor, you're muted.
Yes. So yes. So first, the things to say is that those categories are unfortunately not mutually exclusive. So for the religious names, what I used is a classification developed by Orjan Sakala, which basically takes as religious all name with a suffix and by Eddin, Ettin, in the Allah, Ullah. So it's only a fraction of those names. A lot of Arabic names have a strong religious connotation, but I didn't go through all of them to classify them. So they are not mutually exclusive. So for an example, Arabic name, you have Jalal, Jamile, Elif, Fatima, Hamide, Malik, and
right. So like Mehmet, for example, would be an Arabic name, not a religious name in this categorization.
So yes, so for Mehmet, so Mehmet would be Turkish, would be the Turkish translation of Muhammad. So Muhammad would be religious and Arabic. Mehmet would be Turkish, but not pure Turkish. Pure Turkish is still another category which is not Turkish. And unfortunately, I haven't, in a mutually exclusive way, classified the names or excluded the one that are in a...
Interesting. So for example, I remember I had a student many years ago, very gifted student. Her name was Hatice. And it took me a long while to understand that that was Khadija in Arabic. So in your coding, if somebody names their daughter Hatice, that's a Turkish name.
So it depends. Sometimes it's the Turkish writing of an Arabic name, and sometimes it's the Turkish translation, in the sense that some people could be called Muhammad and other Mehmet. But in the case of Hatice, perhaps there was not the Arabic used. So then it's Arabic. So I used already made lists.
Got it. Okay, this is fascinating. The next person I have is Uri Inspector.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for being here and for presenting your brilliant research. My question was whether you think it answers a historical question or something that's more fundamental to politics and more universal. I'm just thinking today, in an age of kind of 24-hour mass media, social media, where most people in many countries live in cities, not in far-off regions where maybe like a visit from a politician will be less monumental and life-changing than it would have been back then, maybe. Our local communities maybe are less structured around local landowning elites in the way they used to be. You know, how does your thinking transfer to today's context? Is the role of leadership, you know, can the same principles be thought about, or do we need to fundamentally change the way we think about it?
Thank you.
Great question.
Yes, excellent question. So first, you're right that today's, when there is a leader visit, it will be confronted by social media, by media coverage, etc. So the information that the leader brings will be brought by other sources, which was less the case at the time. Still, there was of course media and newspapers, but people were not reading as much. So. But then I do think that, and that's why he was doing it. Like if it was not efficient, or if it did not matter that the president was coming to a small town, he would not have done it. So I think it's still a special event that's contributes to build the imagined community and represent the symbolic symbols that create national identity too, at least in the national narratives. And that is still also the case today. I think when you meet with someone, it's more about the identifying the effect. To do the same thing today would be stronger because you have other sources and social media, etc.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, the next person I have is George Theodosiu. Go ahead, sir.
Hi. Hello.
Hello.
You hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The questions seem to be all tangential on the same conflict between ethnicity, religion, and so forth. And my question is, how do you reconcile the difference between Arabic or Muslim religion and Turkish identity, with the mandated population exchanges, in which the mandate was ethnically based and the actual practice of the exchanges was purely religious.
Great. Thank you, sir, for that question.
Yes, completely. So the part of the homogenizing policies and this demographic engineering they did, and the population exchange was also one of the policies aimed at creating this new identity that was built around one ethnicity, the Turkish ethnicity, and one religion mostly. So creating minorities, etc. So those happened. I'm not. I know the localities that were affected or not, and can control for this. But I'm looking at the effect of the leader taking this as a given. The fact that this happened before, between 1920 and 1923.
Okay, so you know, I have a question in the chat that I would like to relay to before I continue with the audience, and this is, I don't know if I have permission to relay the questioner's name, so I won't, and forgive me. So this questioner asks a very important question, which is, you know, the Ataturk wasn't the only one at around this broad time who was trying to engage in this type of social transformation. And another prominent example is Reza Khan, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty. And, you know, he tried to do very similar things and it ultimately failed. Do you have a perspective on that? So, for example, one might read this paper and the initial hypothesis they would offer is, well, maybe he didn't visit enough places. Whereas I think we would probably, and you being a gifted economist, and, you know, according to Larry Summers, economists have 10 IQ points on political scientists, would probably highlight structural factors, no? That there's something about Iranian history that they didn't have the long legacy of westernization. Although, in fact, when I think about the Qajar dynasty, they kind of did have something similar. So anyways, just a perspective on that divergent example.
Yes, no. So I'm not a specialist, and I don't know well the Iranian history. So, of course, in all cases, it's long-lasting historical processes, and also institution deep social deterministic factors that I were talking about. And yes, this is like the setting in this case enables me to identify an effect that is localized and that does not explain everything. Other things are happening too. It's just that his campaign effort in this case worked.
Got it. Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left, and so I'm going to come next to Dr. Daniel Tavana. Let me unmute him. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much. I have two quick questions. I think first, in the among the so-called treated villages, I guess presumably there's a lot of variation, even in the extent to which, even in the treated villages, there is sort of this take-up. Do you have any insight into why maybe even some of those places that were treated with a visit may not have kind of seen this high level of take-up? I'm curious sort of what insight you might have into what kind of other forces were at play that made this sort of less likely. And the second, and to kind of build on the Iranian example, there's obviously in this time, illiteracy is quite high. There's a kind of new and growing state bureaucracy. And if it's anything like it was in Iran, a case I'm more familiar with, the state bureaucracy is doing a lot of the sort of, you know, registering of citizens, choosing their names, and so on. And so could this be sort of an effect of sort of a bureaucracy effect, where the bureaucracy in some places that Ataturk happened to visit were more sort of favorable to the autocrat, and thus kind of registered citizens in this way in higher numbers? Just a thought. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, those are great questions. So yes, for sure, there was a heterogeneous treatment effect, and I started looking at it. So it's not stable yet, but for an example, and it goes to the previous question, it seemed that places where Muslim population from the Balkan arrived react more strongly. which corresponds to the historiography that says that they were so more likely to assimilate and more eager to assimilate and to learn the language, but they didn't to become Turk as Muslim. So yes, there is heterogeneity, and I'm working on this. And second, so for sure, and that I can't measure, but so yes, it can be an effect on local elites that also triggered down to the bureaucracy and how like people were talking to their mortar and like really local, simple bureaucratic things. About the like how civil codes were made and like registration of names, etc. So I can't tell you more. I don't know. I've read, so it was I never read problems in terms of the first names. As a big law was about changing the last names, they had the bureaucratic infrastructure to do it. But yes, it could go through this. I can't observe it, unfortunately. But
Yeah, that's a really great question. Can I just stay for a second on it, just to make sure that I actually fully understood the mechanism that was being proposed, which was a kind of top-down bureaucratic mechanism. So I show up, I want to name my son Jalaluddin, and the guy says, no, a good name for your son is going to be Timur. And so it's not really reflecting, a bottom-up uptake of these norms, but rather the operation of the state.
Okay, I hadn't understood the question then. So in this way, so yes, it's part. So both could happen.
Yep.
It could both be that you have more zealous and it works better locally, or on the contrary, that there was some repression. I think that they didn't have much the tools, but you still could have bureaucrats locally that were super eager, super nationalists, and would say no to someone coming with a very traditional Arab names. So there is currently some researcher, like fascinating research at the Setobak, Emmanuel Surek, so he's a French historian who precisely, so he looks at the surname law, not first names, but he precisely say that the state, so it's really against this top-down view of the state, is the fact that, okay, there was the law, but even there was a lot of different version of these last name laws and like circular, so I don't know how to translate, but it gave some margin of maneuver to local bureaucrats to apply it in a very repressive or not way locally. So it could go both ways.
Got it. And just one historiographical question. In many countries, they have lists of approved first names. So, you can't name somebody in, I don't want to make an error about a particular country and they get 1,000 emails that I got it wrong, but there's some countries in my head that I think have laws about, the name has to come from this book. And did Ataturk never try to do that? Like, that would seem to be totally consistent with who Ataturk was. He would say, here's the book of names, you got to have a name from this.
So yes, they did that actually for the last names exactly like this. So
but not first names.
So I don't think so. I guess, of course, for first name, people were impacted by the last name laws. So there was a stock of pure Turkish name, and actually people took much more than what I found, almost 70 or 80%. I might be wrong, but a lot of Turks took pure Turkish last names, way less for the first names, which shows that there was a margin of maneuver and less control over the first names. But yes, there was a stock of names. They were saying you should not take foreign, not nationalistic names or weird names either, and you should take a nationalist names, etc. So they were controlling this.
Got it. Okay, John Griffin. I think I have to unmute him. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Doctor, for the fascinating research. I think similar to Mr. Theodosiu's question, the question that just came to my mind was, I know that at about the same time, the name change reforms also applied to ethnic minorities in the new state. And I wonder in your research if you had any localities that were multi-ethnic, and if so, whether you had the chance to see whether there were similar or different effects on different ethnic groups in terms of whether visits were likely to cause them to change their names. And if so, if you think that reflects sort of zeal for Turkish identity such that it could have existed, or something else?
Thanks a lot for this question. Great question. So for an example, when I look at Kurdish provinces that he didn't visit, so I don't, they're not included in my analysis, but on the contrary, those names decreased, which goes in this idea of a potential backlash or sort of resistance. And second, it's kind of interesting because I think from the historiography, we still don't know yet what was the view of the state towards non-Muslim minorities. So that's what I said. There was still a margin of maneuver, and in some places you had very zealous nationalistic bureaucrats that could repress and force them to adopt those names. But other, perhaps it might be worse, they asked them to keep their name, Armenian names, or like the fact that so that they stay visible, because when you see the names, you can control more the population. And also in a way, like we don't want you who are impure to take a pure Turkish names. So it was not, so the state view is not clear about this, and there was still some uncertainty on what was happening there.
This is really just really fascinating research, because you're getting at, you know, the kind of core issues about identity and how identity comes about modernization and the role of leaders. And certainly, you know, I teach at the Kennedy School. I have students who want to feel that they can make a difference in the world. And you're actually presenting an example of leaders who actually were able to affect something as vital and as foundational as the individual self-conception. So I think this is really fascinating and, you know, extremely important research. I would be remiss in the couple of minutes we have remaining if I didn't ask you to kind of maybe go a little bit outside of your comfort zone. You know, you're a great scholar also of Lebanon and the economy in that country and the broader Middle East. And I've learned a lot actually from reading you about the Lebanon's economic dysfunctions. You know, do you sometimes think that, you know, Lebanon, this country that has, you know, these very different confessional communities where national identity has actually been something that has been very difficult to achieve. Do you ever sometimes think, God, I wish Lebanon had an Ataturk?
I mean, it's important to say that the Ataturk policy and a big part of everything that happened was extremely repressive and violent. So, so in a way, like all the violent part, of course not. Then the ability to like not repress, to have minorities, but in a way that's but that can still instill something supranational and national identity, what we don't have in Lebanon and it is much needed, would be great. Is the solution a strong man? I don't know, or at least let's say, as in this case, a leader that can coordinate elites or rally people around the movement. Why not, as long as it's not done in a repressive and violent manner it was done in the Turkish case.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating question. I mean, you drew the comparison with Nasser. And, you know, I feel like in the Nasser case, we got all the repression and the violence without the commitment to the Enlightenment. You know, I'll take the repression and violence, but give me the Enlightenment politics. Okay, we're going to do one more question, if you don't mind, and that's from Dr. Tuba Boskaya. So I need to unmute her, but I can't find. She just texted me here. Sorry, Tugba, you need to raise your hand so I can unmute you. There you are. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Go ahead.
Great. So I had the chance to read this paper at the Politics workshop, and I really like it. But I was going to ask you a question about public education institutions, because as far as I know, many places that Ataturk was visiting were actually, I mean, he was specifically visiting public education institutions, new schools, and other education investments. So, and as far as I know, you are not looking at, I mean, including those education institutions as a control in your models. I was wondering if that might be something missing there, because I think if he intentionally visits towns where there are new public education institutions and schools, and if they are omitted from the model, I guess, yeah, there might be some an alternative explanation there.
Thank you
for that.
Yes, that's a great point, and I'm currently working on this because I do believe that he really wanted to strengthen education and locally. So from what I've seen, for example, I only have data on minority schools, and there is no difference between places he stopped and didn't stop. So again, they are comparable along these ways, and the main targeted cities that are super different probably along educational infrastructure as well are excluded. But for sure, I think it's central to the story here. So education was key. And I would like to test whether the leader and education and other institutions are complementary.
You know, that's a great. Sorry, did I step on the end of your sentence? Forgive me if I did.
No,
No, I think this is really fascinating. I'm not sure I fully can I try to restate what I thought Dr. Buskaya's question was, that basically there's some endogeneity here. In other words, the places he stopped are places where he was going to visit a school. So there's a school that's built there, and he's going to. So there were what the treatment is not Ataturk's visit. It's that they put an institution there that he then went to go and visit. Is that, did I understand the question correctly?
Yes, so currently I don't have data on all schools for those places. I only have from the minority schools that existed before 23. And I'm currently willing to look at the evolution of school localities. So not only controlling for the schools that were already there, but how they, like, for example, if there were more teachers or not sent, etc. But yes, but for the moment, the fact that they are very comparable in terms of pre-existing educational infrastructure makes me believe that if we added education, it would not completely explain what's happening. Right. I think it's complementary.
Got it. No, this is great. And I actually want the result to hold, because I want to believe that Ataturk made a difference. So I just need to again thank you, Dr. Lydia. You see the questions and the deep engagement with this topic. Usually, when you have a paper that is as technically virtuosic as yours, the engagement tends to be very technical. But I think here you're writing about something that's so important, and you're doing it in such a clear way that it's everybody can see its importance and is really eager to engage with it. So thank you for sharing this with our audience, and thanks to our audience for your really great questions. I hope everybody will join us again next week, when we will have another speaker, Dr. Safwan Masri of Columbia University, who will speak on another modernizing dictator, and that is Habib Bourguiba, the supreme ruler of Tunisia from 1957 to 1987, and somebody who is often described as a pocket Ataturk. And so I hope that people will tune in then as well. Join me in thanking Dr. Lydia Assouad.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you. All right. Goodbye, everybody.